vast amount of the equipment that the West had given to Ukraine. So Ukraine did not achieve any of the goals that were stated. By the way, many of our generals predicted great victories, which shows once again the vacuousness of such predictions by our generals. So they called it wrong. I never believed any of that hype beforehand. So none of this really surprises me because I'm listening to all of the different perspectives on this war from various military experts, including on your show, Judge. And we shouldn't be surprised at this debacle. Zaluzhny says it's a stalemate, but it's not a stalemate. Russia has the offensive now, and in various parts of the front line, Russia is making advances, and those advances could become significant because Ukraine really has lost so much manpower. That means so many people dead and wounded that Russia has, it appears, a real opportunity for breaking through Ukraine's defense lines. And so maybe Zaluzhny is really just expressing wishful thinking. Now, Zelensky is expressing delusional thinking, which is that Ukraine still has the offensive, it's still going to win, it's never going to negotiate, and so forth. From the point of view of the United States, this is a debacle. Well, thank you. I think many of us have been saying this is a debacle and was heading to a terrible debacle basically from the start. I wrote well over a year ago that this was the neocons' latest debacle, and nothing that has happened has really, in that sense, been a surprise. But now the Biden group and the Democrats are scrambling what to do. This is an election year. The president's approval ratings are plummeting. The president's polling numbers are awful. So they're scrambling, and that's why they're looking at some kind of deal or way to freeze this conflict. But the Russians are saying, we're not freezing this conflict. We would negotiate a true political settlement, but we're not freezing the conflict so that you come back again in 6 months or a year with your NATO enlargement and provocations and new weapon systems. So the Biden administration had its back to the wall even before the disaster in Israel and Palestine broke out on October 7. So this is really a mess, and the mess is building. Clearly, the political crisis in Ukraine is extreme, whether Zelensky faces a coup or some kind of domestic upheaval has to be a possibility taken seriously at this stage. I'm not predicting anything, and I certainly know nothing, on the inside, so I don't want to be misunderstood.
Right.
But this is a disaster that has been unfolding now for quite a long period of time. It's been obvious to those who are looking objectively at this. That means those who are not relying on the New York Times for their information, but are relying on more objective information coming from a wider variety of sources,
Professor
including
Sachs,
your show.
Thank you. I would argue that this is almost entirely the fault of the United States. The Russians and the Ukrainians had an agreement until Boris Johnson and Joe Biden said, "Oh, no, we have your back. You're going to become part of NATO." And then we spent 113 billion, and now the president of the United States has asked the Congress, I don't think he's going to get it, for another 68 billion, all because they want to expand NATO. Will the United States, forget the West does what the U.S. demands. Will the United States ever stop this maniacal expansion eastward of NATO, notwithstanding the natural and probable consequences of such an expansion?
Well, the NATO expansion has stopped because the Russian army has stopped it, in effect. But what continues is the Western insistence that NATO will expand. So the reality is already clear. But the continued insistence that NATO will expand means continued war. This has been my point all along. All Biden had to do, going back years, and as recently as December 2021, before all of this broke out, was to say NATO won't enlarge, and then there would not have been a cause of war. The war would not have taken place. But even till today, they still make these claims that, yes, NATO's going to go to Ukraine. So Russia says, well, if NATO's going to come to Ukraine under your view, why are we to stop right now and let that happen? We've been clear for 30 years and extremely clear since 2007, when President Putin spoke at the Munich Security Conference, and extremely clear since 2008 when Bill Burns sent his "niet means niet" memorandum to Condoleezza Rice. That this is a no. So as soon as you stop saying that it's going to happen and we get down to real political negotiations, then there's a possibility of this war ending. This is very basic. And I think what's so important to understand is this is a group that has played a bad poker hand miserably by continuing to up the ante at every stage, knowing that it's a failed hand, or not even recognizing that it's a failed hand. So if you go back, if I might just very quickly, you go back to 2008, all we had to do was not put NATO enlargement on the table. And then in the Yanukovych period, 2010 to February 2014, Russia wasn't demanding territory. Russia was demanding a long-term lease of the Sevastopol naval base. That's all, not territory. And then the United States conspired in the overthrow of Yanukovych. Bad move. That was February 2014. Then Russia took Crimea, not wanting it to fall into NATO hands. But even then, it wasn't demanding the territory of the Donbass, of eastern Ukraine, of Lugansk and Donetsk.
And even then, it was bloodless.
Even then, it was saying, look, don't shell the Russian people, don't attack them, give them autonomy under an agreement that was negotiated, the Minsk II agreement. Well, the West, the United States, rejected that. It told Ukraine, you don't have to do that. We don't believe in a federal Ukraine, as if the United States should be the one making a judgment like that, especially after a treaty was negotiated. Then as late as December 2021, when President Putin put on the table a draft U.S.-Russia security agreement, they were not calling for the annexation of eastern Ukraine. They were calling for the Minsk II agreement to be implemented and for NATO to stop saying that it was going to enlarge. In other words, for Ukraine to commit to neutrality. So every step of the way, then the special military operation began on February 24th, and the idea of that was push Zelensky into negotiations. Well, those started a few days after the February 24th incursion. It wasn't to conquer Ukraine, it was to enforce neutrality, stop the NATO enlargement. Zelensky agreed on that in March. The United States rushed in and said, no, you don't agree. We need to weaken Russia. You fight on. We're going to put on all of this weaponry. You're going to get the HIMARS. You're going to get the nuclear option of finance. We're going to cut Russia out of the SWIFT banking system. And all of this predictably failed, overblown hype. And in the end, what we could have expected from the beginning, for Russia, NATO enlargement is an existential issue. NATO is not able to defeat Russia on an existential issue, not least because of 6,000 nuclear weapons, by the way, so there was always a point of escalation. But now with conventional forces, it's been shown to be the case. So you're completely right. This is a disaster that we have made because we absolutely can't listen to anybody else. And President Biden,
Joe Biden is proving the accuracy of what your friend and colleague Henry Kissinger once famously said. It is dangerous to be an enemy of the United States. It is worse to be a friend.
Well, he actually said, if it's quoted correctly, that it's fatal to be a friend.
Wow. All right. That's even stronger.
Now, I don't know if that's apocryphal or not, but that's how I quote him.
Wow.
You know, when you hear we've got your back for the U.S. saying it, you better worry, because we had the back of a lot of countries, from Afghanistan and Vietnam, South Vietnam, and many others. And we don't understand the politics of the wars that we get in, because these are all about politics.
Let's
and if you don't understand the politics, you blow it.
Let's get into the politics of the other war, Professor Sachs. Is the government of Israel committing war crimes?
Yes, clearly, and the whole world.
Is it using American equipment, weapons, and ammunition with which to do it?
Of course. Well, this is absolutely plain, and it's tragic. And more than 10,000 people have been killed, civilian, innocent people in Gaza, and of those, more than 4,000 children. And another hospital was bombed today, from what I'm reading on the wires, and it's an absolute disaster. And they're besieging a Gaza Strip of 2 million people, cutting off water, food, fuel. Of course, these are war crimes.
Will there be accounting, legal, political, military, whatever it is, accountability for these war crimes?
There will be geopolitical accountability, in the sense that the world is aghast, and it's turning against Israel dramatically, and it is turning against the United States for being the one to backstop this. And it's putting a lot of pressure on the U.S., and Israel can't do this without the U.S. So, yes, this is geopolitical accountability. I would not expect any other kind of accountability automatically. It's so haphazard. But geopolitical accountability, we see it in the United Nations every day. There's a vast majority of countries that are saying stop. I was just in the Middle East. I was in the United Arab Emirates, and I was meeting with a lot of people. And you can imagine how that region feels about this. Co-religionists, people in Muslim countries, they're absolutely shocked and aghast that this takes place day after day, with bombings of civilian population, mass deaths, no diplomacy. Netanyahu quoting these biblical passages as his justification that are really awful.
Does he believe that he and he alone can decide life and death in Gaza?
That is how he is acting, because he's not negotiating. He's not trying to negotiate anything. He's not trying to explore any other options. The underlying premise of Israel's actions is that there's no other choice, because Hamas is a mortal threat, and the only way to do it is through this mass civilian bombing and deaths, and that countries have the right of self-defense. Now, if you unpack that, this is all wrong, because Hamas is not a mortal danger to Israel. Boy, it did a huge amount of killing in a massacre on October 7th, but those were people on foot carrying guns because Israel let its guard down. So that was a security failure. It wasn't Hamas with the massive tank companies moving over Israel and invading Israel. Not at all. We should understand what this was. This was a terrorist attack that came because Israel totally let its guard down, and that was Netanyahu's responsibility, and he completely failed. Israel today is not at a mortal threat from Hamas because Hamas can't even do the same thing again. The border is now secured because when they blew it before, now they're not going to do it presumably the same way again. So that's the first point. The second point is this isn't the only way to address this issue. There are other ways to address this issue that are going to cost a lot fewer lives or no lives at all and actually get to a real peace. And that is through negotiation and diplomacy, something that Israel completely discards and the United States has proven to be incompetent at in recent years. So that way would say, look, we understand that there is an underlying political issue here, and that is the profound failure over more than 50 years to secure the political rights of the Palestinian people. And we're going to solve that problem, but in the context, Hamas needs to be demilitarized and demobilized with the support of the Arab countries and Iran. Now, that may sound far-fetched, but it's not far-fetched at all, because what we should be aiming for is a political solution. And what Israel is doing is mass killings, war crimes, and so mobilizing the hatreds that Israel is profoundly undermining its real security. And moreover, every day making it more likely that this turns into a devastating regional war, because U.S. troops are under attack every single day right now by militias through the region. And when one missile hits and kills a lot of Americans, God forbid, and it happens, if that does happen, we're going to suddenly have the demands here from our hotheads, of course, in Congress. Now we have to go bomb Iran and everything else. And this could turn into an absolutely general war. Now, you think Israel's going to be secure in the midst of that? No way. This has nothing to do with a real response to Israel's security. It has everything to do with fury, with revenge, and with a deep point, which is that Netanyahu has absolutely no intention, not an iota of intention, of any kind of political settlement with the Palestinians, because his whole government is premised on the fact that you never have to have a political settlement with the Palestinians. That's what we're backing. We're backing an impossibility. We're backing a profound injustice. Well, that's what we're backing right now.
I want to talk to you about the United States backing Israel. And as a springboard for that conversation, I want to play a tape for you. I'm not even going to tell you who's in it, but you'll know both of these people immediately.
You make the observation in your book, and you say that you have said it many times when you were president of the United States, that no president is ever going to desert Israel, right?
Correct. I put it more bluntly. I said, as I told congressional leaders during the 1973 Yom Kippur War, no American president will let Israel go down the tube.
Right.
Democrat or Republican, it's not an issue.
That is stated fairly categorically, and yet in your book you make it clear at the same time that Israel really is not of any enormous strategic value to the United States anymore.
That's correct.
So why then would the United States continue to burden itself with huge loans, in some cases outright grants, to the Israelis, jeopardize possibly young American fighting men, when there is no strategic value involved, or little strategic
Because the
value?
United States is concerned by more than strategic values. That's maybe a weakness, but it's the way we are. And there are moral issues involved here. We don't have an alliance with Israel, as you know. They're not an ally of the United States in the technical sense. But we have a bond to Israel that's much stronger. It's a moral commitment because of what happened during the Holocaust, and a moral commitment because it is a democracy, the only democracy in that area.
I saw you smiling. I'm sure that
brings back memories.
Yes. Was he right then? Is he still right? Are his statements still resonant today?
You know, during his presidency, this was immediately after the 6-Day War, which was 1967. And what happened in the immediate aftermath, and it's very important for people to understand, Israel, of course, occupied the West Bank and the Sinai and Gaza in the 6-Day War. It occupied the Palestinian lands. And then it had to decide what to do about all of this. And in 1970, Israel started to implement pieces of what was called the Alone Plan, named after one of the generals and leading politicians of the day. And the Alone Plan was put facts on the ground in the form of Israeli settlements in Palestinian territories, in strategic places, so that basically Israel would never relinquish the occupied territories. And what happened starting around 1970 onward is that Israel has established so many settlements that there are now more than 400,000 Israelis on the West Bank and more than 200,000 in East Jerusalem. This is a lot. And these are, many cases, zealots. They are fervent. Anyway, they like their homes and their communities, even though they're in the middle of Palestinian territory. And many of them are true believers in what's called Greater Israel, or Eretz Yisrael, of the greater land of Israel, meaning a biblical interpretation that actually goes back in the Old Testament to the book of Joshua, that God gave the Jewish people, according to this religious view, all of the lands that are west of the Jordan River and reaching into Syria and so forth. And with this view, the idea is never compromise with the Palestinians. And unfortunately, this became the real policy of Israel. And here we were backing Israel, which makes sense, but not backing a political settlement. And Israel made facts on the ground, which made a political settlement extraordinarily difficult.
Is Nixon saying to Joe Biden, you have to back Israel? Not saying it directly, but you understand what I mean by that. You have to back Israel no matter what, even if they commit war crimes, even if they commit genocide.
Well, I think the question for us is, what do we mean by Israel? We have the state of Israel, and we have occupied territories that are Palestinian territories. And it has been the world opinion, and it is formally U.S. policy, even reiterated by Biden, that there should be a Palestinian state on the Palestinian territories. But it doesn't happen. This has been the view for decades, but it doesn't happen. Why? Because the Israeli government has no intention of it happening, even as we repeat over and over again that is our policy. Joe Biden said it himself just a few days ago, that the two-state solution is U.S. policy. And that is in innumerable resolutions of the UN Security Council and the UN General Assembly. It is the overwhelming view of the world. It is absolutely opposed by Netanyahu. Let's be clear. He's the obstacle to a political settlement, he and what he represents politically, which is not the dominant part of Israel, but is the dominant part of the coalition that governs Israel right now. But in any event, it puts the whole world at danger, and it puts the United States in an absolutely untenable situation. Because if we back Netanyahu's policy, what are we backing? We're backing massive war crimes in Gaza with no prospect of a real settlement. That's what we're backing. So what are we doing? We're faking it right now because they want to get to the election and win re-election. They don't want the truth, like on so many issues of American politics. Biden doesn't explain anything. He doesn't tell the truth, but most U.S. presidents don't, by the way. But it happens that our present president also isn't explaining the issues. And the issues are that the current government of Israel is an absolute obstacle to peace. This is absolutely clear. And that the United States is put in an intolerable position as an accomplice to war crimes. And we don't want to be an accomplice to war crimes. And we don't want to see tens of thousands more Gazans killed and wounded by Israel's bombing and its ground operations. And we don't want American soldiers dying by shelling by Islamist forces in the region that are coming to the side of the Palestinians. And we don't want, I believe, World War III erupting. And so we need to have some diplomacy. Now, the good thing that I've been trying to point out from October 7 onward is this is a case where the whole world essentially is of the right view, which is that the solution to this crisis is Palestinian political rights alongside Israel. Now, the Israeli government doesn't accept it, but the whole rest of the world does. This is a case where U.S. interests, Russian interests, Chinese interests, of course, UK and French interests
are the same.
Named the 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council. We're all on the same side of this. So this is time for the UN Security Council to do what it's supposed to do under the UN Charter, and that is to take responsibility for the global peace before this gets completely out of hand. But that requires the President of the United States to actually have some gumption and explain issues correctly and say very clearly to the Israeli government that there is no solution by this approach, that the only solution is a political settlement, and it's time for a political settlement.
Now, I didn't
would shake Netanyahu out of power, and that would all be for the good. But that doesn't have to be done directly by us. We just have to state the facts.
Right. I didn't see the entire interview between Ted Koppel and Richard Nixon, so I don't know, President Nixon. I don't know if Koppel asked him, but backing Israel for moral reasons doesn't mean agreeing with everything that the government does. Well, we'll end with that. The next time we talk, I'd hoped we got to it today, but we've run out of time. I want to talk to you about Joe Biden's statement that the United States is the indispensable nation, and the dangers that come from that kind of a statement out of the mouth of the president.
Boy, you could imagine the eyes rolling around the world when they heard that whopper.
Right.
So this is something for us to discuss and just understand what's happening in a complex situation where we're not told the truth on most things. So you have to figure out what's going on because no one's going to tell you, and maybe last of all, the New York Times. So it's a real problem to understand this crisis. Let me basically say at the start that we're on an extraordinarily dangerous path of escalation between Russia and the United States. And the war in Ukraine is largely, in my opinion, a proxy war. It's Ukrainians fighting and dying. It's American weapon systems, intelligence, so-called officials, strategists, tactical finance that is backing this war. So this is, to all effects and purposes, a war between the U.S. and Russia, though fought in a proxy way so far. Our goal, we're told from the U.S. side, is to defeat Russia and force it to leave Ukraine after what is described as an unprovoked invasion on February 24th. I think there were lots of provocations, so the situation's more complicated. But let me just start with the desired outcome. I don't understand it. I don't understand how it could conceivably be achieved. We think that weapon systems and sanctions and fighting will wear down Putin or get him overthrown, and something will change and Russia will go home because they realize that this is not worth it for them. And maybe the U.S. model, and by U.S., I don't mean us, the American people, we have no part in any of this. The model of those who are prosecuting the U.S. side of this is that it's like Afghanistan or Vietnam was for the United States, that after it gets sufficiently bloody and useless, you just go home. I think there's a huge difference, which is that from Putin's perspective, but I think it's more general than that. It's not just one person. From the perspective of the Russian political actors and elites, the situation in Ukraine is not like America in Vietnam or America in Afghanistan. It's exactly in the neighborhood. And so it's viewed in Russia, I think, I'm not sure, but I think in much, much starker terms, that we will not lose this war because this is a war about Russian security. That's the Russian view. Okay, you could say they're crazy, not crazy, but I think that's the Russian view. And if that's the Russian view, and our view is we're going to defeat Russia, and Russia's view is we're not going to be defeated, I don't understand what anybody really has in mind other than continued escalation. And it is shocking, but not surprising, that every day now we have stories, will he or won't he use nuclear weapons? As if this is just another casual story in some newspaper column, as opposed to the existential threat to our survival, which it is. So I believe we don't have a plan. I don't think we have a strategy. We want to defeat Russia, and yet Russia doesn't want to be defeated. And even if we could, which I have my doubts about, defeat Russia on conventional weapons basis, Russia has 1,600 active nuclear warheads and 6,000 warheads in total. So I don't understand what our idea is. And again, when I speak of our, it's not mine, it's not yours, I think. It's our government's. And I don't even know who's really responsible for this, but it's a very narrow group and it has almost nothing to do with the American people, and no one's been asked about it, and no one's been informed about it, and no one's been told about it. And yet here we are near the brink of nuclear war. And we are near the brink of nuclear war. That's true. So to my mind, we are in a wildly wrong-headed approach. Oh, how did we get here? Again, this is much contested. There are two very different narratives. One narrative is Putin is, has delusions of grandeur and thinks he's Peter the Great and he's going to recreate the Russian Empire. That's the American story we're told all the time. I have a very different view, which is that we got here because the United States just can't keep its goddamn nose out of anyone's backyard. And we kept pushing NATO enlargement. And I was there 32 years ago as advisor to Gorbachev and then advisor to Yeltsin and advisor to Kuchma, first president of independent Ukraine. And I was an advisor to Yatsenyuk just after the 2014 events. So I've watched this pretty close up for 32 years. And I think the US is the provocation. This does not play well in the US media. In fact, it doesn't play at all. I can't get an op-ed published in the US media. They're not interested. They don't want to have any debate at all. So I think it is absolutely true, by the way, that the US and Germany told Gorbachev in 1990. Gorbachev offered, by the way, to disband the Warsaw Pact. That came from Gorbachev. We said, if you disband the Warsaw Pact, we will not use the occasion to move NATO to the east. And that became a condition, actually, for German reunification. And it was absolutely explicit. Now, since our government lies about everything, the narrative is, oh, we never promised, which is not true. And there's a whole vast documentary record of the US promising no enlargement. Well, of course, as soon as the Soviet Union went away, we thought it was a juicy opportunity to enlarge NATO, and started with Poland, Hungary, Czech Republic, 1999, and then George W. Bush Jr. added 7 more countries, 3 in the Baltics, so 3 right on Russia's border, Bulgaria and Romania, which is Russia's Black Sea region, and Slovakia and Slovenia. And we continue NATO expansion. And in 2008, Bush said, now we'll go to Ukraine and to Georgia. And to my mind, this was just absolutely the most provocative thing we could do. Because now we're pushing NATO right up against Russia's core security concerns. And the Europeans, many European leaders told me in 2008 how dangerous this was and how much they were against it, but the US calls the shots. So, ladies and gentlemen, to my mind, we've been stirring the pot the whole time. And there are many complications to this story, so I could talk for hours about the details. But in 2014, the pro-Russian president was overthrown. The US narrative is it was a mass public upheaval against a corrupt president. And I was there on the ground soon afterwards, and I know that the US played a direct role in the overthrow. And the Russians call it a coup. So we have competing narratives, but the Russians say, look, you overthrew the president friendly to our country. We don't want you anywhere close to our borders. At the end of 2021, Putin put forward security demands to the White House. At the core of them was, don't expand NATO. I called the White House at the end of 2021 to beg them, negotiate. We shouldn't be expanding NATO anyway, negotiate. And I was told, no, we have an open door policy, which means that anyone that wants to join NATO can join NATO. And I said, that's crazy. This isn't a right, this is a threat to another country. This isn't about rights, this is about the effects on the neighbors. And I said, do you believe that Mexico has the right to have a military alliance with China? I don't think so. But that's what you say about Ukraine, that they have the right to have a military alliance with the United States. I said, in any event, they can ask, but it's not prudent for us to do it. Well, the White House refused any negotiations. And then there are competing stories, and I won't go into all the details, but Putin invaded on February 24th, and we've been escalating ever since. And the last week has been filled with news stories, these casual stories of will he or won't he use nuclear weapons, as if, we're trying to predict the outcome of the Super Bowl. It's bizarre to me. I've just never seen anything so reckless. And I have no confidence in the U.S. government, no confidence in what we're doing to head this off, because they're dead set on doing whatever it takes. That's what they say all the time, whatever it takes to win this, for Ukraine to win this war. And since I don't think Russia is going to lose this war, short of nuclear war, to my mind, we're on a recipe of continued escalation. And I'll stop with the reading. I want to read you one set of words from my favorite speech of modern times by an American president, which is President John F. Kennedy's speech on June 10, 1963. And just to give background about this, I wrote a book about this speech because I love it so much. After the Cuban Missile Crisis, Kennedy and Khrushchev knew the world's insane. We can't go on this way. We're going to blow everything up. We need to find a way to peace. And Kennedy gave this speech on June 10, 1963, to convince Americans that it was possible to make peace with the Soviet Union, which was not a conventional view. How can you make peace with the commies? And Kennedy said, we have to check our own attitudes. They're human beings. They have the same desires as we do, and they want to live in peace also. And so if the agreement is mutually satisfactory, it can be mutually observed. Very, very wise words by President Kennedy. And the whole speech is completely wonderful. And I've driven my family crazy for years by making them listen to it on multiple occasions, especially when I was writing the book. They had to listen to it 10 times at least. But in any event, Kennedy said something that I really, really want to emphasize. He said, and it's the most important statement for this moment. He said, above all, while defending our own vital interests, nuclear powers must avert those confrontations which bring an adversary to a choice of either a humiliating retreat or a nuclear war. To adopt that kind of course in the nuclear age would be evidence only of the bankruptcy of our policy or of a collective death wish for the world. So what Kennedy is saying is, you never, with a nuclear adversary, make them choose between a humiliating defeat and a nuclear war. But that's exactly what we're proposing to do right now with Putin. Not only that, every day Zelensky tries to humiliate Putin, not tries to solve a problem, but to humiliate Putin. Maybe, of course, he's rallying his supporters, but we get closer and closer to the precipice. I can't stand listening to Zelensky, I'm telling you, because maybe I can understand, although I don't really understand. If I were next door to Russia, I'd have a different language, because I wouldn't want to be nuked either. But what he's doing in terms of provocation is extremely dangerous, and we're playing the game because we're saying whatever they do, that's all right. They have to win. I believe that they're the ones shelling the nuclear power plant. I'm absolutely almost sure that it's Ukraine shelling the power plant. Our papers say we don't know who's doing it, but since Russia controls the plant and Ukraine wants to win it back, I think Ukraine is shelling the nuclear power plant. I think, by the way, just to add to the discussion, that we are the ones that blew up the Nord Stream pipeline. I'm pretty sure that was a U.S. action. When I said it on television a couple of days ago, they cut me off. They took me off the air immediately because you're not allowed to say this on U.S. television. But it's pretty much conventional wisdom in other parts of the world. even by reporters that don't write it in their paper. If you talk to them privately, they say, of course it's the US. Who else would do it? Who else could do it? Who else had an incentive to do it? So let me stop there. It's so dangerous. We have no debate in this country, in Congress or any place else. They're not asking us to be part of this discussion, even though it's our lives on the line and our children's lives and our grandchildren's lives. New York City is extraordinarily vulnerable, I don't have to mention. And our congressmen aren't saying boo. So one thing I'd love for us to do is reach the New York delegation to just say, this is reckless. Stop it. We're in the 60th anniversary of the Cuban Missile Crisis this month. We don't want to replay it. And we would never have survived it had it not been for Kennedy in that position, because if it had been any of his advisors, the world would have been destroyed. But he was smart enough not to destroy the world. So let me stop there and turn it over and open for discussion. Thanks a lot.
Thanks so much, Professor Sachs. Yeah, we have a lot of really thoughtful and important questions, and there are a lot of folks who are skeptical or curious as to how realistic it would be for the U.S. to negotiate with Putin, depending on, on what people's opinions about Putin and Russia's aims. But so what?
Let me just say one thing about that. We don't know whether negotiations would work or not. It's true. I personally believe they would, because I know a lot of the Russian leaders over a long period, and I believe that there is absolutely a way to negotiate, and that the central question is NATO enlargement, and that's the question the U.S. has never accepted even discussing. But let me say the following. Suppose we negotiated something and that it was satisfactory, but then Russia violated it, which is possible. Then we would be in no worse situation than we are right now, but we would at least have the whole world know that we went the extra mile to try to find peace and the other side violated it. And that, to my mind, is the right approach. The right approach is to try for peace. And if it fails, you end up in war. But if you say there's no one to negotiate with, then you're surely in war. So I want to try the exit ramp, not guaranteeing, because nothing in life is a guarantee, not guaranteeing it would work, but believing that it would. I have lots of reasons to believe that it would. Russia is not a sole actor by itself. China is a very important actor in this. China actually would like a peace agreement. China would like to insist on a peace agreement. India would like a peace agreement. They don't want a peace agreement in which NATO enlarges because the US is targeting China too. But they want a peace agreement that is satisfactory. And so there are many ways to enforce a peace agreement beyond just a piece of paper. There are many interests at stake. And by the way, the Russians honor agreements at times. We do too sometimes. We break them a lot also. The Ukrainians broke agreements. They absolutely would not implement the Minsk agreements. So the Russians say, look, how can we negotiate? You lie to us, you cheat. Britain, France and Germany were supposed to be the guarantors of the Minsk II agreement. When the Ukrainians say, we don't like this agreement, then France and Germany remain silent because they're on the Western side. So there is a lot of deceit, but it's not just Putin. And our division of the world into the pure good and the pure evil is phony, and it's phony here as well. So my view is, and I can tell you, all over the world, people basically agree with what I'm saying, which is, yeah, this is a war about NATO enlargement. And if it isn't, we should prove that. We should say, okay, we won't enlarge NATO. Now let's see if you stop the war. If you don't, then it exposes this isn't about NATO enlargement. This is about your empire building. Then you get the whole world on side. But right now, the whole world isn't on side. I'm not on side, but a lot of the rest of the world's not on side because they believe this is a proxy war between the US and Russia.
So in terms of a negotiated settlement and what is really possible, NATO enlargement would sort of have to be the key piece of that.
I think it's the center. There are three issues that were mentioned every time. And remember something really interesting, another one of these mysteries. In mid-March, there was a flurry of statements by Russia, Ukraine, and Turkey, which was mediator, that the two sides had come close to an agreement and that they actually exchanged papers. And I spoke with a very, very senior Russian official about this who described this to me. And actually, the Ukrainians put forward the idea of neutrality. This immediately went to Putin. Putin said, let's draft a peace agreement around this. The Russians did. They put it back to Zelensky, and then Zelensky said, no, that's not what I meant. And the strong rumors, which I believe, are that the United States and UK said to Zelensky, hell no, you want us to back you? We're not backing neutrality. And that this was a complete change, and it was the end of the negotiations. So I think the US has been completely uninterested in the negotiations. That week, Biden flew to a NATO meeting in Brussels and declared this is going to be a long war. And then he went from Brussels to Warsaw and said that man can't stay in power. And then a few days later, Lloyd Austin said our goal is to weaken Russia. So I think it's US policy not to have a negotiated solution. I think there was close to a negotiated outcome beforehand. And I watch lots of Russian blogs, and they call for negotiations, which is, if it were Russia's desire not to negotiate, you wouldn't have the Russian bloggers calling for negotiations. I think Russia's idea was we can scare Ukraine into neutrality, if I could put it that way. That was the original idea of the invasion. And I think it was a desperate move, but I think the motivating factor of the move was that the US was heavily arming Ukraine and threatening Russian security. And Russia could not get US attention. This is the basic point. We treat Russia like shit, if you'll excuse me, which is they put forward negotiating demands and we say, no interest. Why should we talk to you? You're a fourth-rate power. You're delusional. We're the superpower. And that, I think, is the basic point. Then we say there's no one to negotiate with after we say we're not negotiating. But if you don't know if there's someone to negotiate with till you negotiate with them. And frankly, we didn't even try. And if we tried and failed, we'd have the whole world on our side immediately.
So you had mentioned that members of Congress haven't made a strong call for diplomatic solutions. And there was a letter in Congress led by Representative Jayapal calling on the Biden administration to make a stronger diplomatic effort toward ending the war. And so why do you think progressive or liberal members of Congress were hesitant to sign that letter, and what can we as grassroots advocates do to push in that direction?
Thank you for letting me know about that. I wasn't even aware of Congresswoman Jayapal's letter, so I'm happy that someone has done it. And again, I'm in Europe these weeks, so I may not know all that's happening in the U.S. debate. But I don't hear a word from officialdom of the contrary. And I think partly people who aren't looking too closely easily can accept the official narrative that, you know, that Putin invaded unprovoked and the guy's a madman and we have to defend freedom. It's a good story. It actually has elements of truth to it, but not very many. And it's hugely misleading, but it is an acceptable story. And I think for most Congress people, it's a kind of the default story. I don't think they know. But what is amazing to me is they don't even discuss anything. So there's no, I talk to a lot of officials, they don't know the history. Even senior officials in the US government don't know the background and they don't care. And so in Congress, it's much worse. But I do think we could do something, actually. I really do think that if we had an online gathering with the New York delegation, because this is urgent, and said, all of you, come on, let's have a discussion together. This is nuclear war, after all. You can spare an hour. And we actually had a discussion with the New York delegation. I bet it would make a difference. I think they just don't know, frankly. There's a lot to tease apart in this. There's a lot of history. There's a lot of, and the newspapers are so unbelievably without analytical edge that it's easy to get completely pulled into this. It is kind of the mainstream story. And so I think that this could make a difference, actually. I really do. I got to hope that it could.
Yeah, thank you. And so I guess a follow-up to that is in advocating for our members of Congress to take steps toward a diplomatic solution, do you think peace activists should demand that the U.S. get out of NATO or take a position of stopping NATO enlargement because the U.S. is using NATO for hegemony?
I think that the peace community should call for negotiations now that can defuse this crisis before nuclear war. I think that is the absolute most important thing to do. People are scared and should be scared. And by the way, every day when I read someone say, we're not going to be intimidated by this, I say, what the hell do you know? We're all going to be incinerated if you get this wrong. And I know, because I've studied it for 50 years, how close we have come to nuclear war. And given that we are on the 60th anniversary of the Cuban Missile Crisis, somebody ought to think a little bit more clearly about this. Maybe our key people in office, or some of them are too young to remember this, or they haven't studied it, they don't understand it, they don't know how dangerous this is. But I think that the focus should be stop this escalation. We are on the precipice. This is crazy. And there is a way to negotiate an outcome. And the two sides were negotiating in March. Send them back to the negotiating table, but with U.S. support for negotiations. That, to my mind, is the key.
Great, thank you. And I'm just keeping an eye on the time and wondering if we're nearing the end of our time with you, or.
Yeah, I'm sure that I'm late for something, but let's take a couple questions and then we'll finish up.
Sure. So a lot of our members were interested in understanding the effects of the war on climate change and food security. And so I wonder if you could speak to that.
Oh, we have to step.
6 o'clock, Pastor, 6:30, Tulsi, and then we're off to.
Okay, I'm finishing.
Yeah, it has to finish by 6.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I have to finish shortly. My wife is telling me, and she's the boss. So, sorry about the effects of all of this on climate change and
food security.
And food security. Everything is bad about this crisis. There is no silver lining, period, because you cannot address any big challenge in an organized way in the midst of war. And so the immediate effects of all of this, as you know, have been economic destabilization, soaring fertilizer prices, soaring food prices, soaring energy prices, and that's a part of what's happening. But I'd say even a larger part is there's no international cooperative processes on development or climate or anything else as our geopolitical situation darkens. We're hardly speaking to the Chinese. We are, of course, at war with Russia, and institutions like the G20, which are supposed to be working on global challenges like climate change, are dysfunctional right now because they include the two sides to this conflict. And there are many, many countries in deep hunger crisis right now that get no attention. I know it because they appeal to me in my United Nations context role. I met world leaders at the UN General Assembly a couple of weeks ago, some in absolutely desperate condition. And I spoke to a very senior UN official yesterday who's trying to help on the hunger side, but he can't even get access to senior policymakers right now, even though he's representing Secretary General, because our institutions are not paying attention to any of these things. They're paying attention to the war and to the election.
Great, thank you for that.
Maybe we should stop at this point, but just to say, if you could see a way to getting some of our delegation online, or you'd like me to help with that, but I'd ask you to take the lead, but use my name and so forth. I think this would be a great next step, and really necessary and a core democratic step, because our congressmen